You know those people who just can't wait for Christmas? You know what I'm talking about? Well, apparently, my family and I have become those people because yesterday we decided to put our Christmas tree up and decorate our whole house for Christmas. Yep, that's right. The costumes were barely put away. The candy hasn't even been sorted yet by our kids, and my kids have already been begging me to pull out those Christmas boxes from the garage and set up Christmas. And of course, my son Noah, he insisted that this year he's going to put up the tree all by himself. And so we have one of those fake trees, and so you have to stack all the pieces together. And of course, he's determined, I'm going to put this up by myself this year. I'm going to hang all the ornaments. I'm going to stretch the branches out. I'm going to do all the things. And he couldn't quite reach all of it, right? So I had to step in. I had to help him. But when we were done, he had such satisfaction. He stepped back and he said, look it, I did it. And I smiled because I realized, and it sank in, how often do I do the same exact thing with God? I try to take charge of my own life. I try to make things work out my way. And when it does, I love to take the credit. But I forget how much help I actually had along the way. See, most of us will say that we believe God is in control, but oftentimes we live very differently. We live as if everything depends on us. And we may find ourselves praying for his guidance and yet at the same time panicking when life doesn't go according to our plan. In other words, we trust God is in control until he actually takes control. And as we continue the story of Ruth this morning, it's going to force us to wrestle with that contradiction that we may find. And we'll ask to ourselves this question: how can we trust God's plan even when we can't see what's next? And today, in the second week of our series where we're going through the book of Ruth together. And we've titled this series, Finding God in the Ordinary. And through this series, we are invited to rediscover hope, purpose, and God's presence in the midst of our everyday routines. It's about learning to see the divine in the daily experiences, to recognize God's redemptive work as it's happening, not just in the spectacular moments, but in the subtle ones, in those conversations we're having during the week, during our commute to work, during those prayers that are whispered in a quiet and maybe solo room. See, not once does God speak out loud in the book of Ruth, but evidence of his working is found on every single page. And so this series should serve as a reminder to us that God is always at work, even in the ordinary and the mundane. And through the daily faithfulness of two women, Ruth and Naomi, we are seeing that God is rebuilding what was broken. He's redeeming what was lost. He's restoring hope right in the midst of their ordinary lives. And my hope is that through this series, it'll ignite a spiritual hunger in you. Because the world oftentimes makes it really easy for us to mask the emptiness we may be feeling in our soul. We live surrounded by noise, surrounded by distractions, surrounded by endless consumption. And yet deep down, I believe so many people in the world are walking around spiritually hungry, longing for something that is going to fill the ache inside of them. But that hunger isn't something that we should hide. I believe it's an invitation from God to pursue him more deeply and more intimately. And so my prayer through this journey through the book of Ruth is to awaken a hunger within you, not for more activity, not for more achievement, but for more of God's presence. Because I believe when we open up our heart to God's presence and his story, we're going to find that even the ordinary rhythms of life is where he's inviting us to experience his redeeming love, and he will restore and renew every aspect of our lives. And so last week, as we dove into chapter 1, we saw that God often uses seasons of emptiness to lead us back towards his fullness. And this week, we're going to continue in chapter 2, and we're going to see 3 different truths. And the first one is this: we're going to see that what feels like coincidence is often God's plan at work. And secondly, we're going to see that good character is hard to live, but it's easy to see and always honored by God. And then thirdly, we're going to see that God's redemption often unfolds quietly through daily faithfulness rather than dramatic miracles. And so our text today is going to be in the chapter 2 of the book of Ruth, starting at verse 1. If you brought your Bibles, I encourage you, turn there with me as we read it together. Last week, we read chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, and it was a story centered around Naomi, a woman who became a victim of heartbreaking circumstances. There was a famine that drove her from her hometown in Bethlehem to a foreign land in Moab. But there, tragedy struck again, as her husband died, and soon afterwards, both of her sons died. And Naomi was left with nothing but grief in the company of her 2 daughters-in-law. Then, in her despair, Naomi heard that the Lord had visited his people, that he had brought food to their land, and so she decided to return home. And one of her daughters-in-law, Ruth, made a bold and faith-filled decision to leave everything that was familiar to her behind and follow Naomi, declaring, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." And so we're picking up the story this morning as these two widows, broken, uncertain, but clearly not abandoned, are back in Bethlehem. So picking up the text in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says this. Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. Naomi said to her, go ahead, my daughter. So she went out, entered a field, and began to glean behind the harvesters. As it turned out, she was working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Now, verse 1 of chapter 2 marks a new scene of the story, where a new character is now being introduced, a relative whose name is Boaz. And the text tells us that he is a man of standing, meaning he is from a wealthy and a high respected clan. And his name means in him is strength, which is the author's way of indicating to the audience that he is just the person that is available to assist these two widows. And as the passage continues, Ruth is allowed to go to the fields and glean the leftover grain. And gleaning was a law God instituted that gave the poor, the resident aliens, the widows, and the orphans the right to gather the grain stalks that were being left behind after the field workers had finished tying up the reaped grain stalks in preparation to transport to the threshing floor. God's law provided permission to gather this excess food that would otherwise go to waste. However, it's clear from this passage and other passages in Scripture that people did not always grant permission to glean. This is why Ruth adds to her request in verse 2, behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor. She recognizes that because she is a foreigner and generally despised status, she may not receive fair treatment. So she expresses her hopes to find someone who is going to allow her to glean. And Naomi grants Ruth's request to go out and glean, and she does so by using two Hebrew words indicating that she is still in the midst of grieving. And Ruth goes to the field, and in verse 3, we're told that she just happens to end up in the field of Boaz, who's from the clan of Elimelech. In verse 3, the phrase is translated, as it turned out. And what it literally means is that her chance chanced. And this is a hyperbole that highlights Ruth's accidental finding of Boaz's field. And so what the author is hinting out right here is that what we may call coincidence, chance, luck, or fate is actually God's divine providence. And even though Naomi is still grieving, Ruth doesn't wait for things to change. She acts in faith. And as she does so, we see how God is constantly at work behind the scenes, directing and controlling her situation. And so what this text is telling us this morning as we are reading it is that what feels like coincidence is often God's plan at work. And so to trust in God's plan, it begins by believing that what feels random isn't random at all. See, God is quietly orchestrating the details, even if we can't see it, even if we can't understand it. And when we attribute our good fortune to his providence, we will begin to see that even the small things are a part of his greater story that he is writing. And so this text teaches us that we should develop eyes of faith that are able to perceive the hand of God in the apparent coincidences that may happen in our lives. Then we can see that God is always at work. And we live in a world that denies God's sovereignty because we would rather be in control ourselves. Oftentimes we attribute the results of the events that take place in the world as results of independent action or free agents. Life is a series of random events that just occur. And our world rarely thinks to ever attribute those events that take place in our lives as ordained or patterned by a divine creator. And our world loves to think that way because if we are free agents, then we might have some kind of control over our destiny. We might be able to determine our fates. And so for many of us, the idea that we aren't actually in control, but some other divine being is, that would actually make us panic on the inside. And that's because we live in a world that's obsessed with control. We track our sleep. We manage our diet, we monitor our investments, we measure our steps, but we can't control some of those events that just happen to us. When our jobs fall through, when the diagnosis changes everything, when the relationship we've invested so much time into begins to crumble, and when life starts to slip from our grip, what do we call it? We label it bad luck. But Ruth's story invites us to see a deeper hand that's at work through all of it, a God who is guiding us, even those things that feel like random chance, and he's guiding all of it towards redemption. And when we live as though life is random chance, we'll often fail to account for our inability to make it on our own. And as we look at the story in Ruth, Ruth took positive action. She went out to go and glean some food, but there's no way that just by chance she could ever end up in Boaz's fields. The odds are just stacked against her. And the Boaz, that if she actually found that field, that she would receive so much extreme kindness. And if she had shown up in any other field that day, her fate may have been disastrous, both mentally and physically. You see, on her own, she may not have been able to make it, but God directed her steps, leading her towards that redemptive future. And that God who directed Ruth's steps to meet Boaz in that field is still directing ours today. Maybe it's not through flashing signs or grand miracles, but maybe it's through the quiet choreography of everyday faithfulness. You see, we are called to live in accordance with his word and trust that he will supply our needs in order to accomplish his purposes. And many of us would rather live under that illusion of control than face the reality of surrendering to our Heavenly Father. And so for some of you in this morning, as you're hearing this, trusting that God is in control is actually an invitation for you to surrender some of the control that you've been holding on to. And that may mean you have to loosen your grip on things that you've been clinging to. Maybe you need to loosen the grip of that perfect job you've been hoping for. Maybe you need to loosen your grip on that ideal living situation you've been hoping for. Maybe you need to loosen your grip on your timeline for marriage. Maybe you need to loosen your grip on the picture of when you are going to start your family. If we learn anything from this story this morning, it's that we serve a God who is in control of our circumstances, whom we can trust is leading us for our benefit, even if we can't see it in our current moment. And this way of living, it involves surrender. But surrender becomes easier and easier when we pledge our allegiance to our Heavenly Father, because when we do so, he calls us his children. And he tells us that he is a good father who wants to give good to those who ask. So let's be a people who recognize God's hand in every coincidence, who are always looking out for the ways that God is working and writing his story, keeping watch for the subtle ways he is opening or closing doors. And as we become aware of his presence, our need for control would then begin to loosen. And we begin to submit to his greater plans, his greater purposes, trusting that he has good things in store. So we're going to continue reading, pick it back up the text in verse 4, and we're going to see Ruth's first encounter with Boaz. Let's pick up the text in verse 4 as it says this. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. "The Lord be with you." "The Lord bless you," they answered. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" The overseer replied, "She's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with the women who work for me. Watch the field where the men are harvesting and follow along after the women. I have told the men not to lay a hand on you. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner?" Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servants." At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here. Have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men, "Let her gather among the sheaves and don't reprimand her. Even pull out some stalks from her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up and don't rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. We're going to pause right there. See, as the text continues, we see God's divine providence continue as Boaz's arrival and Ruth's arrival overlap. Boaz arrived just then. It's no coincidence. It's divine timing. He notices Ruth, a foreigner who by all cultural standards should have remained invisible, and he calls her daughter. The one word that restores dignity to someone who society oftentimes overlooks. And Ruth's humility meets Boaz's generosity, and in that intersection, a picture of God's providence at work through ordinary faithfulness. Boaz then inquires about who she is, and her social location is provided, but not her name. And Boaz addresses her and grants her permission to glean and promises her protection. Ruth acknowledges his authority and unexpected generosity, and the author uses a play on words that Ruth is being recognized as being a foreigner. In other words, Boaz has noticed the one who would typically go unnoticed. And what Ruth longed for in verse 2, she has clearly found favor in someone's eyes. God fulfilled it through Boaz's kindness. She came seeking scraps, but she left with an abundance. Her good character has not gone unnoticed, and Boaz's response reminds us that God sees, he remembers, and he rewards acts of faithful love. We see in verse 11, Ruth's reputation, it's positive among the community because of her devotion to her mother-in-law, Naomi. And Boaz's words foreshadow a blessing that is going to come for Ruth like wings of protection over her. And then he gives her the favor of joining him for lunch. And he orders his men not only to refrain from rebuking her, but also to drop extra stocks from their bundles for her to pick up. See, this initial interaction between Boaz and Ruth is where the author gives us a lot of insights into both their integrity and their character. And Boaz acknowledges Ruth's tremendous acts of kindness, love, and loyalty towards Naomi. She has left her father and mother in order to live with a people that she does not know. Her act of courage is commendable. She is depicted as a person of integrity and character. And Boaz is depicted this way as well. He not only recognizes her, but repays her with an extraordinary amount of hospitality and generosity, not just by allowing her to glean, but by treating her as one of his own servants, inviting her to have lunch with him and then giving him her extra grain stocks. See, both characters exemplify in this passage a deep-seated kindness, love, and care for others. The Hebrew word used for these acts of love and kindness is the Greek word, or the Hebrew word, hesed. And there's no parallel word that encaptures the magnitude of this word, but it's a voluntary, selfless, loyal act of loving kindness towards another. It's the type of love that God has for his people, a love that never abandons them, love that is always at work towards the good of the other party. But the main difference of this love in our modern definition is that it's not expressed in a feeling, but rather as an attitude that leads towards action. And both characters exemplify this love not by standing still, but by taking notice and taking initiative. They didn't just wait for someone else to step in or step up. They took initiative and did what needed to be done, meeting the needs of those around them. And living this out isn't always easy. It often takes courage. It takes surrender. It takes a selfless attitude. But these actions are what prove the depth of their integrity and character. Both characters are willing to risk danger of what could happen by taking an act of faith and doing what is right for the good of another. And fortunate in this case, their actions are rewarded. And so what this shows us is that good character may be difficult for us to live out, but it's easy to see and always honored by God. And even when we don't know the outcomes, we should follow Ruth and Boaz's example, living with integrity, compassion, generosity, because our faithfulness in the ordinary is a reflection of God's love. And we live in a world that applauds empathy at a distance. We post about compassion, but often stop short of practicing it because it might cost us something. It might cost us our time. It might cost us our comfort. It might cost us our convenience. And the story of Ruth and Boaz reminds us that godly love doesn't end in a feeling, but is fulfilled through action. And for us to live that out, that same kind of modeled by Ruth and Boaz, we have to be willing to step out of our comfort zones. It's much easier for us to love from a distance, to offer words instead of our presence. But godly love steps in when it would be much easier to step back. It means to give, to listen, to serve, despite the cost. And oftentimes we make excuses so we don't have to live this way. Oftentimes I hear the excuse that we're telling ourselves we're too busy to help our neighbor who's struggling or to call a friend who's going through a hard time. But the truth is we're actually hiding behind productivity in order to avoid the discomfort of actually reaching out. Oftentimes I see people make excuses and avoid getting involved in messy situations when there's no clear solution. Whether it's a broken family, an addiction recovery, homelessness, they often feel like the situation is too complicated, it's too unsafe, so they refrain from doing anything at all. Or even in the church, we can have this mindset. When we get into a conversation that gets a little difficult, and then we end it with, "I'll pray for you," which is our polite way of ending the conversation rather than beginning a relationship of ongoing care. And sometimes we even hide behind our service within the church. Serving all that we can within the local confines of the local community, but failing to go outside of the church walls, to our workplaces, to our streets, or to our schools. And what I love about this section of Ruth is that the opportunities Ruth and Boaz had to live out godly love, it didn't happen in the temple, it didn't happen in a church service. It happened in the everyday space of their everyday lives. The same is true for us. We have opportunities to live out a godly definition of love in our everyday lives as well. So what would it look like for us to take the vision of love that we see here in this story and then to bring it into our own daily lives? What implications would that have for your workplace environment? What implications would that have for your interactions that happen around your dinner table in your home? What implications would that have on your marriage? You see, last week we canceled our small group because we were going to have a pumpkin carving night at our home, and we didn't get enough participation. People were sick, out of town, what have you. It was a busy week. So we were excited for a night off. We were looking forward to having that night off. It was one of the only days in our week that we'd have off. But it suddenly became an opportunity for us to show hospitality when one of the group members didn't read the text I sent them and knocked on our door. We didn't have any food prepared. We didn't have our house ready or cleaned up. There was literally laundry on our kitchen dinner table. And we quickly found the opportunity. It would have been much easier and much more convenient if we had just said, there's no group tonight, and closed our door. But we decided we'd take the opportunity to invite them into our lives, invite them into our mess. And we didn't have any dinner, so we grabbed some stuff out of the fridge and we threw in the oven and we gave them whatever scraps we had. But I share this because loving others isn't always convenient. It may cost us something. It may cost us to sacrifice, but that's what we're called to do. And in John chapter 13, verse 35, Jesus tells us that everyone will know we are his disciples by the way that we love one another. See, it is through our living out of godly love that people will see that we are different. They will see that we belong to Jesus. So you see how important it is for us to live this out. And living it out isn't easy, but there are real needs that are happening all around us that we can rise to the occasion to show God's love. Godly love first begins with an awareness before it leads to action. So we have to notice those who are vulnerable, notice those who are isolated, notice those who are in need. Then we can start to take action. And in our modern culture, it can be easy for us to get lost about debates about what government systems should or shouldn't do. But Ruth and Boaz shows us that embodying godly love starts with a personal responsibility. Boaz didn't try to fix all of the poverty in Israel, but he did what he could. He used what he had. He protected and he provided for a foreigner who was in need, who just walked into his field that day. What a beautiful picture of what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself. And if we want to be that kind of people who embodies God's love by meeting the needs of those around us, it will only come as an overflow of our relationship with God. And that means we must spend time in his presence in order to experience his love. It means we need to meditate on his words, letting it shape who we are and what we value. It means we also need to commit to living the kind of love and integrity that would mirror his heart. You see, good character is hard to live. It's easy to see, and it's always honored by God. So let's be people who choose to live out his values, becoming a light to our broken world. Ruth entered that field hungry and uncertain, but she found favor in the eyes of Boaz. So let's pick back up the text in the second half of verse 17, and let's see Naomi's reaction as Ruth comes and reports about the favor she found in the field that day. The text says this. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead," she added. "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabite said, "He even said to me, 'Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain.'" Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the women who work for him, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. See, Ruth continued to glean the fields. Then she threshed the barley she gathered and measured about an ephah. And this was enough food for about 1.5 weeks. It was about 30 pounds of grain. And this is a startling amount that she would be able to glean from the fields, indicating that she truly was richly blessed. And so she carried it back home, showing Naomi all of the leftovers, all of the grain that she got, plus the leftovers from her lunch with Boaz. And Naomi asked with excitement and anticipation, "Where did you glean from today? Who was it that decided to bless you with so much?" And Ruth begins to tell her about Boaz. And Naomi recognizes that God has clearly arranged this encounter. Boaz isn't just known in the community for his kindness, but he also happened to be one of their closest relatives, a guardian redeemer. And a guardian redeemer was a close family member responsible for rescuing relatives from hardship, whether by redeeming their land, marrying a widow to continue the family line, or ensuring their protection. This role reflected God's own character as the one who redeemed Israel from slavery in Egypt. Ruth's permission to glean has now extended in Boaz's fields from the barley harvest, which would have maybe been around April time, to the wheat harvest, which would have been in about May. And Naomi encourages her to continue gleaning there for her own safety. And then towards the end of this chapter, in verse 23, we get a signal that the spring harvest has now ended, and there are no longer any day-to-day opportunities for Boaz and Ruth to see each other. We are left at the end of this chapter with a tension of how God will pave a way forward for Ruth to now interact with Boaz. And through Ruth and Naomi, both of them have been victims of tragic circumstances, but we see that peace and well-being are still possible in their lives. The author uses this story to remind the nation of Israel that even in their darkest day, the period of the Judges, a time marked by catastrophe and social decay, that there is still hope. God's redemption is still at work. And I think we also need this reminder in our world today because we're living in a world that feels increasingly chaotic and is declining morally. You see, the book of Ruth reassures us that amidst chaos and decline, God is still at work, and his story of redemption is quietly unfolding, most often through daily faithfulness rather than dramatic miracles. You see, we live in an age where people are, I believe, longing for peace in this chaotic world, but they often run to find it through self-care or distraction. Maybe they find themselves endlessly scrolling or binge watching or meditating to find calm. But when the noise stops, the anxiety rushes back in. And I believe that if our peace depends on something that we can lose, then it was never true peace to begin with. And Jesus is the only way to find true peace amidst our chaotic world. And the redeeming act of Boaz towards Ruth and acts of redemption ultimately point forward towards Jesus because he is the ultimate redeemer who rescues us not just from physical hardship, but from sin and death. In Galatians chapter 4, verse 4, it says this, "But when the time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship." See, at just the right time, God acted to redeem those who are lost and make them his children. He didn't redeem the world through a massive miracle, but through the birth of a child. See, God's methods of redemption often unfold quietly through everyday faithfulness. And it's through Jesus that we can have peace with God, a peace that transcends our circumstance, a peace that leads to hope for a brighter future. And some of us, we've been living in Naomi's chapter 1, feeling full of bitterness, of envy, waiting for something in our lives to change. Maybe we've been sitting for a while praying for provision, for healing, for a sign that God is somehow still working. Well, would this story remind you this morning that God's redemption often unfolds quietly? In daily faithfulness, in the gleaning, in the small acts of kindness that build up over time and then eventually manifest into hope again. So what if this week, instead of waiting for a miracle to happen, you simply looked for God's mercy in the ordinary? Let's be a people who choose to rejoice in God's quiet acts of redemption. Because we always have a reason to rejoice because God has come to our rescue to bring us life out. Bring us into a glorious life. But what would it look like to live with a mindset focused not just on what God has accomplished in the past, but also how he's currently working in our lives each and every day? Let's be a people who are mindful and noticing the subtle ways that God might be working redemption into our own story. And you may not see the whole picture right now. You may be standing in the middle of a harvest field, unsure if God is doing anything at all. But if Ruth's story teaches us anything today, it would be this, that God's quiet redemption is already beginning to unfold, and that you can trust him with what's next. As I began this morning, I shared how the story of Noah and the Christmas tree, and how it reminded me of the times that often we like to take credit for our accomplishments, thinking we're in control, when God is actually the one who is in control, who's been helping us along the whole way. But it's easier to say that than it is to live that, because we often panic at any sense that we've lost control, and it forces us to ask this question: how can we trust God's plan even when we can't see what's next? And what we've learned from Ruth chapter 2 is this: that we can trust God with what's next when we recognize his hand in every coincidence, when we reflect his heart through daily faithfulness, and choose to rejoice in his quiet redemption. So let me ask you, where do you find yourself in this story this morning? Maybe you're someone who needs to recognize God's hand at work. Well, I wonder if you should ask yourself this question: am I willing to surrender my desire for control and trust God to direct my path? If you find yourself resonating with needing to reflect godly character in your life, maybe this is your question to contemplate. Do my attitudes and actions align with God's character? And then maybe you're in a place where you need to rejoice. You need to start to notice God's hand at work. And you need to ask yourself this question: am I noticing the ordinary moments where God is quietly writing a story of redemption in my own life? And so, as you probably knew if you were here last week, we have these Ruth journals that we were going through together as a church body. And so if you haven't grabbed one yet, I encourage you, there are some in the back, grab one on your way out. We're doing this together. And so there's prompts in here each and every week. And there's only one prompt for the whole week, and the idea is you would repeat it throughout your days this week and see what else God might want to speak to you. But this week's is an exercise to pray through Scripture. And this means reading this text that we just went through today, Ruth chapter 2, reading it 3 times. The first time, simply listening to the story. The second time, noticing what stands out to you. And then the third time, praying through what this means for your own life. And then I encourage you, take the space that is written there on the next couple of pages and the blanks, and then reflect on your experience. What did you hear God saying through the passage? What is he trying to communicate to you? And make sure to write this down, because we have an opportunity at the end on the 23rd of November, where in service we're going to be able to share what God has been speaking to us, the ways we are grateful for how he has showed up in our lives over this past month of doing this series together. And so I believe the journaling is going to be really helpful as we get to encourage one another with the stories of how God has been working in each of our lives.